Welcome back to Judgment and Decision Making. My name is Dr. Padilla. Now we're going to talk about what actually leads to action in order to reduce the pain of others. Starts with this question: does any of what we've learned in the last few lectures actually predict who does some compassionate act to lessen someone else's pain? And does any of this predict whether the person acting does so effectively? How can we effectively help people once we've identified their pain? Now, there's two types of pain that have been discussed in the book. The first is empathy, and the next is sympathy. Empathy is when you literally feel the pain of another individual. It's not just theoretical, you have a physical bodily response to their pain. The next one is sympathy. This is where you conceptually understand their pain, you relate to it in some way. There's a variety of possible adverse effects associated with each. For the first, sympathy can give you a sense of completion, where you have taken an action simply by feeling someone's pain or understanding their pain, and therefore you don't actually have to take action to help them in any way. For empathy, the issue that's talked about in depth in the book is that sometimes, rather than acting to actually help someone reduce their pain, you're acting to reduce your own pain. If you're feeling their pain, you might be acting simply to reduce your own discomfort, not theirs. This is illustrated in this comic. And we've seen this a lot in our everyday lives, where maybe you tell a friend about your problem, and rather than wanting to help you, your friend wants to get out of the conversation, because it can feel awful to an individual to experience someone's pain. This is also why some parents won't take their kids to get vaccinations, because they don't want their child to go through the pain of getting a shot, because their response to pain is so strong when they see their child going through a painful activity. So there's situations where if you have too strong of a pain response, you'll be less likely to act to alleviate someone else's pain, because you simply want to avoid the situation, or it becomes all about your own pain and not theirs. And this was some really interesting work done with Buddhist monks. This individual was a translator for the Dalai Lama. And what they did in a research study is they confronted him with images of individuals suffering. And they wanted to see how his brain activated in different contexts. And what they first had him do was to try to empathize with people. And what he said when he was trying to empathize, trying to feel their pain, is that the empathetic sharing very quickly became intolerable to me, and I felt emotionally exhausted. Then they allowed him to take his normal strategy, which is to focus thoughts on compassion. And during this period, when he was thinking about compassion, rather than focusing on someone else's pain, this is when the amygdala became more silent, and they saw dopaminergic activation, meaning that he felt positive feelings toward that individual. He said a warm, positive state associated with strong prosocial motivation occurred, meaning that he would more likely be willing to help to relieve someone else's pain. There's follow-up work that looked at different types of training. One focused on empathy training, where you were trying to feel the pain of someone else. And as we can predict, there was heavy activation of the amygdala, and people had a nervous or anxious state. But they also tried compassion training, where people were told to focus on a feeling of warmth and care towards a distressed person. And that had heavy activation of more cognitive areas of the brain, coupled with the dopaminergic regions, and produced more positive emotions and a tendency towards pro-social behavior, the tendency towards them actually helping people. So this is, smaller work. It hasn't been replicated in many contexts, but there is some positive indication that if you focus on compassion rather than empathy, you're more likely to have positive feelings that will lead to actions. If you just focus on empathy, you might have such a strong emotional reaction to that pain that you don't take appropriate action. So there's a question, doing good can feel good, which raises the classic question, is there a selfless act that contains no element of self-interest? The very part of the brain that is most central to empathy is the ACC, which has evolved to observe and learn from others' pain. We talked about that in the last lecture, how the ACC is really built to learn from someone else's pain so that you can have an indication of what to avoid in terms of your own activities. It's a self-serving function to learn by having an emotional response evoked. Now, there is dopaminergic activation when people are being charitable. For example, there's a study where subjects were given money while in a brain scanner, and they had to decide whether to donate or keep the money. Now, interestingly, when there was charitable giving, the dopamine reward system was activated when an observer was present to see someone donate the money. However, when there was no one present, there was actually more dopamine reaction to people keeping the money rather than donating it. So you feel great when you donate and someone observes it, but then you feel better if there's no one looking and you just keep the money for yourself. Is the element of self-interest ever truly absent? Here's another really interesting study where, again, they put people in brain scanners and they were given unexpected amounts of money. They could either be taxed that money, i.e. forced to give their money to a food bank, some portion of their money, or they had the opportunity to voluntarily donate the same amount of money. Now, if someone was truly altruistic, what you should see is the exact same activation for those two activities. In both cases, money is being given to individuals that need, so therefore you should see the same dopamine response to those two scenarios. The outcomes, the first was that the more people's dopamine reward system activated to the unexpected amount of money, the less dopamine response to when the money was taxed or when they gave it to charity. Essentially, the greater the love of money, the more painful it is to part with it. If you love getting money, then it doesn't matter if you're taxed or if you give it away, it still doesn't feel very good. The next is that the more dopaminergic reaction there was when someone was taxed, the more likely they were to be charitable. Meaning that there's some group of individuals that have a very negative feeling associated with there being a disparity between your income and someone else's. So they want to reduce that disparity, and they don't care how it's done. They can be taxed, they can give the money away. The most important part is that that negative feeling associated with the disparity is removed. So they were also more likely to be charitable if they had a strong positive feeling associated with being taxed. And finally, this is one's most obvious, there was more dopaminergic activation when someone gave money voluntarily. This was across all participants rather than being taxed. It feels better to give money than to be forced to give money. And that's pretty straightforward. Okay, summary here. Everything about our past has honed us to respond to one face at a time, a face that is local and familiar, and to a source of pain that we ourselves have suffered. This is really why it's so hard for us to give money to people on the other side of the planet. If we see someone right in front of us that needs help, we're more likely to act. We're particularly more likely to act if we relate to that person, if we know that person, and if we have experienced the same type of pain as that individual is experiencing. Most of us typically require some shared amount of pain to even notice that someone is in need of help. However, a fair degree of detachment is needed to actually act. You can't feel too much pain. You can't faint when you see blood. You have to have some amount of detachment in order to effectively help an individual. And finally, how do you actually help? It can't be a fully cognitive process or a fully emotional process. You can't actively work to hold in your mind that you need to help people at all the time, and you also can't entirely rely on your emotions. What is the best approach is to automate. The things that we've automated we're great at. We've been potty trained, riding bikes, telling the truth, you can automate that, and helping someone in need. So if you can automate that process, you no longer have to use cognitive control to actively try to help someone. It just happens automatic every time.